Section 11 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 11. Education, Illegitimate Children, Orphans. Subchapter 66. Illegitimate Children. The influence of education upon crime is shown indirectly by the continually increasing proportion of criminals of illegitimate birth in the most civilized countries. In Prussia, the illegitimate delinquents, who constitute 3% of the whole in 1859, rose by 1873 to 6%, and the women from 5% to 8%. In France, of the 800 minors arrested in 1864, 60% were orphaned or illegitimate, and 38% were the sons of prostitutes or delinquents. In Austria in 1873, 10% of all the male criminals were illegitimate, and 21% of all the female. In Hamburg, 30% of the prostitutes were illegitimate, Hugel, and in Paris a fifth of the Parisian-born prostitutes and an eighth of the country women. In the prisons of Württemberg in 1884 to 85, 14.3% of the inmates were illegitimate. In 1885 to 86, 16.7%. In 1886 to 87, 15.3%. While the illegitimate individuals in the non-criminal population rose to 8.76%, Sickert found among 3,181 whom he examined in these same prisons, 27% of illegitimate criminals, or nearly double the other figures. These were divided as follows. A table displayed on the page, listing percentage of illegitimacy. Thieves, 32.4%. Pickpockets, 32.1%. Sexual criminals, 21%. Perjurers, 13%. Incendiaries, 12.9%. Of the habitual criminals, he found 30.6% illegitimate and 17.5%, a little more than half as many. Of the accidental criminals, he found also the following. Of 1,248 legitimate thieves, there were 52% aversion of work, 32% beggars, 42% vagrants. Of 600 illegitimate thieves, there were 52.3% averse to work, 39% beggars, 49% vagrants. In Italy, the statistics of the prisons show 3% to 5% among the male minors, and 7% to 9% among the females. We may add that 36% of the recidivists in Italy are either natural children or foundlings. To comprehend the greater importance of these figures, it is necessary to recall that a greater proportion of all illegitimate children, at least 60%, and often 80%, die in the first 18 months or 2 years. Marbell can then say without exaggeration that of 4 foundlings, 3 die before they are 12 years old, and the 4th is doomed to a life of crime. To get at the significance of these figures more exactly, I have made researches with regard to 3,787 entries, nearly all adults, in the asylums of Imola, Dr. Lully, of Padua, Professor Tebaldi, and of Pavia, and also with regard to 1,059 entries in the City Hospital of Pavia in 1871, and I found that there were 1.5% of foundlings in the asylums and 2.7% in the City Hospital, and nevertheless the mortality is less among the illegitimate in Pavia than in many other places. Age and conditions being equal, foundlings furnish 20 times more delinquents than insane persons. We may affirm then, with the greatest certainty, that the greater part of the foundlings that escape death abandon themselves to crime. Doubtless heredity enters largely into this result. Most of these children are the fruit of sin. They have no name to uphold, no rein to stop them when spurred by passion, no mother who, by her assiduous care, affection, and sacrifices, aids in developing noble instincts and suppressing tendencies to evil. They find an honest, living hard to get, and are inevitably drawn toward evil. If they have no perverse tendencies, they acquire them by imitation. On the other hand, philanthropic institutions like orphan and foundling asylums have also an evil influence, for, as we have seen, a multiplicity of contacts always fosters criminality. Subchapter 67. Orphans. That abandonment and the lack of education play a great part in producing criminality is demonstrated by the great number of orphans and stepchildren found in the prisons. In Italy, among the juvenile delinquents, in 1871 and 72, there were from 8% to 13% of stepchildren. Brace tells that in New York, 1,542 orphans and 504 stepchildren were arrested for various offences. He adds that 55% of the criminals in the penitentiaries were without father and mother, and 60% of the children arrested had lost one parent, or their parents were separated. According to Marabel, of 100 juvenile prisoners, 15 have been abandoned by their mothers. In Italy, during 10 years, we have an average of 33% to 35% of orphans among the delinquents. Out of 580 insane asylums in my clinic, orphans furnished 47%, and the number of orphans reached 78% among the 1,059 entering the hospital of Pavia. But it is certainly a still more important fact that we find an average of 18% to 20% of orphans among the juvenile criminals, for the proportion of orphans in the general population is lower than this. The same is true of half orphans, who furnish 18% of the general juvenile population, but 23% to 30% of the juvenile delinquents. The Italian statistics show 26% of the delinquents to be fatherless and 23% to be motherless, while among the insane, 51% have lost their fathers and 10% their mothers. It is certain, on the other hand, that the female sex predominates among orphans who are criminals, even more so in the case of foundlings. This is true even leaning out of account prostitution, which is a sort of minor criminality. So what in general arrives at the strange result, while for each 5 male delinquents there is 1 female, in the case of foundlings there are 3 females to 1 male. This is, however, quite natural, for a woman, being weaker and more passionate than a man, has more need of the support and restraint of the family to keep her in the right way, for which she is more easily turned, than a man, on account of the slippery path of prostitution that is always open to her. Here the hereditary influences are very powerful, and women who have sprung from a sexual transgression are easily led into the same error, and from this to graver offences. The great number of foundlings among delinquents explains also the predominance of juvenile delinquents in the urban population, and gives us the measure of the harm done by defective education and by abandonment. Subchapter 68. Vicious Parentage, Education. It is entirely natural that evil education should have a still more deplorably criminal element than even abandonment. We may recall here the large proportion of criminals who were sprung from unsound parents. Sicard finds the proportion of pathological inheritance to be 36%, while Marrow makes it 90%. 6.7% had epileptic parents, 4.3% are descended from suicides, 6.7% from insane persons, while in the case of those guilty of grave crimes, Pender finds an alcoholic hereditary of 37% and Marrow 41%. How can an unfortunate child protect himself from evil when it is presented to him in the most attractive colours, or worse still, when it is imposed upon him by the authority and example of his parents, or those who are charged with his education? We shall comprehend this situation best from actual examples. Fee, a sister of thieves, was brought up by her parents as a boy. Clothed as a boy, she took on a masculine air, and wielded her knife vigorously. One day, while on a journey, she stole a cloak, and being arrested, accused her parents of the theft. The Cornu family was composed of thieves and murderers, habituated to crimes from their tenderest infancy. Of 5 brothers and sisters, only one, the youngest, had shown a strong aversion to crime. Her parents found a means of overcoming her repugnance, making her carry the head of one of their victims in her apron for 2 leagues. In a little while she was so stripped of all remorse that she became the fiercest of the band and wanted to practice the most horrible cruelties upon their victims. The murderer Crocco, who at the age of 3 used to hit his comrades with stones and pluck birds alive, had often been left by his father entirely alone in the forest as late as the 19th year. Fregier tells of the son of the thief, who was his father's pride because he was able at the age of 3 to take an impression of a key in wax. The wives of assassins, according to Vidocq, are more dangerous than their husbands, for they accustom their children to crime, and give them a present for every murder they commit. We have seen, and shall see more clearly in the next chapter, how numerous the criminals are who have immoral parents or families, in which case vicious education and vicious hereditary work together. Here also is a case of abandonment, and for the same reasons, namely prostitution and greater persistency of the women in crime. The number of women subject to these influences is greater than the number of men. To many readers, the influence of education, as shown by these figures, will appear of little importance. But aside from the fact that we must add the figures for foundlings already cited, we must also recall the fact that many crimes have an autochthonous origin, and that many individuals are born perverse and remain perverse, notwithstanding the desperate efforts of their parents to correct them. Among the juvenile delinquents of the year 1871-72, 84% of the boys and 60% of the girls belong to moral families. This is to be explained by a weakness shown by the parents early in the child's training, which later renders unavailing the most strenuous efforts to obtain obedience. Noël Vidocq, Donon, de Marcelli, Le Canier, Abado, Hessel, Frati Valo, Carduch, Trosserillo, Chopin, Azalone, and Dem all belonged to honest families. Rosati told me that after his first thefts, he had many times been beaten by his father and seen his mother weeping bitter tears over him, and he had promised them each time to restore the things stolen. Naturally, they are keeping this promise. On the other hand, it has often been observed, and the investigations of Parent du Châtelet and Mayhew confirm the observation, that thieves and prostitutes who have become rich do their best to bring up their children to lead virtuous lives. End of section 11.